Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining us today for this hopefully very interesting and very important conversation around the emerging landscape of online harms against women and what we can do about it. I'm aware we don't actually have that long for a really in-depth and complex topic, so I'm going to get jumping in as soon as possible, but I'd like to start by introducing my panelists today, who I'm very privileged to be joined by. To my left is Nima Elm. This is the Director for Public Policy for Europe at Bumble. Professor Gina Neff, who is the Director of the Minderoo Centre for Technology and Democracy at the University of Cambridge. And Sophie Gallagher, who's a journalist and Deputy Features Editor at the I newspaper. And Sophie has also written a book about violence against women called What Men Can Do to Help, I believe.
Yes.
Yes, great. So, to start, I wanted to kind of help you perhaps understand the landscape in which we're operating in with these problems, and perhaps the scale of these problems and the complexity of them and how they've emerged in the online age. New technologies, new kinds of social interactions have facilitated huge amounts of new forms of abuse against women online. And so, Gina, to start, I'd love to ask you some context on that evolution and how this problem has evolved and emerged in this way.
We're scaling a very old problem. We know that women face discrimination in society. Women face discrimination in their jobs. Women face challenges in their relationships in the world. And what we have now are technologies that at speed, scope, and scale can democratize harm and discrimination. And so one of the things that I think we really need to keep in mind as we frame this conversation is that what's at stake is the ability for women, marginalized people, people of color, to fully participate in our society going forward. I'm taking seriously the challenge that CogX has put before us today and saying, what do we want the next 10 years to look like? And I'm putting out a call for us to think about the decisions that we make now that will influence what the next 30, the next 50 years look like. And here's the dystopia that could be coming, that we have, say, a metaverse where there are no women, because the harms that they face, the really real harms that they face in their lives are simply too great. They outweigh any benefit of participation. And think about that for a moment, that what is at stake is building a society where the risks to women's participation, from online harassment to technologies that disparage their reputations, that damage their standing in the community, that harm their ability to get employment, that these technologies exist today, and we have the opportunity to do something. But it's going to take all of us, working together. And the scope of the problem today is a mere fraction of what will come with emerging technologies.
Absolutely, it's quite a scary picture you paint of a future where if we don't act now, these problems are only going to get worse and are going to actually freeze out half of the population. Sophie, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about some of the ways that new technologies are being used, in perhaps ways you would not imagine, to target women and to silence them or harass them or abuse them in online spaces.
Yeah, so my interest in this area started when I personally experienced something called cyberflashing, which is the unsolicited, put my tongue back in my mouth, the unsolicited sending of sexual images. Did a lot of research and investigation around that and spoke to almost 100 women who had been subjected to that as well. Now, that was sort of my gateway, my entry into this. And I think in similar ways, we are seeing, when that was particularly to do with Apple's AirDrop functionality, but we're seeing this now in, across lots of different platforms and, apps in particular. One of the ones that I was particularly disturbed about recently was the new Apple AirTags, the advent of those. But in a way, it's sort of, it is about AirTags and it's not, because actually what they're doing is they're just facilitating, as Gina said, it's the same harms, but on new platforms. So with those AirTags, which are the tracking devices, they were being used to track it is, almost exclusively women. And similarly, apps like Strava, I've had women talk to me about being followed on there. And the problem is that lots of this happens, to me, when I was cyberflashed, that was between two strangers, but lots of this is facilitating harm within already abusive relationships. So within the context of domestic violence, domestic abuse, stalking in intimate relationships. So you've got things like Strava being used by partners to, it just all increases control, doesn't it, in every direction. And the Internet of Things as well. I've had lots of people talk to me about things like doorbells and dash cams and heating systems and things like that, which all sound, we know why people use them. They increase ease in our homes and things like that. But actually, when we have not, in any way addressed these old problematic behaviours, and we're just sort of lowering the bar for entry for, if there are just more and more ways for people who have malicious intent to exert control. So one woman I spoke to who was in a coercive relationship, her partner had started using sort of Spotify within, those Sonos systems and things like that, and Hive, things like that within the home even if he wasn't there, he could turn the heating on in the middle of the night or turn music on really loud in the middle of the night, which sounds sort of innocuous, but actually within a context of control and abuse, it's just more, isn't it? It's just layers and layers upon what someone would have been able to do before. So I think it's really important that we're seeing how a really wide range of technologies can be used in this way. It's not, I'm sure we'll talk about this a bit, but it's not exclusively things that might just seem harmful at first, like AI nudification, that you can instantly see why that might be problematic. You might not necessarily see why, other things can be, but until we tackle these behaviours, they just extend the long reach of that control within these problematic relationships.
Absolutely, and I think for maybe some of the men in the audience, and certainly myself, these aren't things that I would maybe even think about as potential ways that these technologies could be weaponized against me, but obviously there's a gender component, which again, potentially male designers, software engineers don't consider, just because they just don't have that lived experience that so many women are now unfortunately having when it comes to the weaponization of these different technologies. Nima, your work at Bumble has been really powerful in terms of helping to put women's voices front and center in conversations around both protection from malicious technologies and also developing more responsible apps and technologies as well. I wonder if you would maybe want to talk a little bit about how Bumble is approaching this issue and the work that you're doing at Bumble to try and help those voices be heard.
Indeed, and thank you all for joining this session. I want to give you a few stats at the front. Women are 27 times more likely to face online harassment. And this is threatening messages, this is unsolicited nude photos, this is abusive content than men. And that's from a study by EU Women Lobby. Another powerful stat that I came across by the Web Foundation found that 52% of young women and girls experienced online harms. And with Bumble, we sit in a unique position because we are a female-founded, female-led organization. And as a tech platform with that composition, we're very unique. It is sad to say that a number, including our founder, Whitney, of senior women in our organization who have public profiles have experienced different forms of online harms directly. And this is across the board. And so for us, when we are thinking about the experience we want our members to have, it is centered around safety by design. Really at the center of it is how women are experiencing our products and our platforms. Because if they have a good experience, then that permeates across the community. And so a lot of the work that we do is not only proactive in terms of safety tools and community policies, because we're overly conscious of just how much women suffer online. So we have broader community guidelines. If you body shame somebody on our platform, that will get you banned. that goes beyond what is usually the community guidelines found in most platforms. At the same time, we're also constantly consulting our members to make sure that we understand what are the issues they're facing, not only when it comes to the dating space online, but more generally. And so Sophie mentioned the point around cyber flashing. Cyber flashing is an issue where we conducted a survey in 2018 to find out just how prevalent it was. And we found that 98% of women that we surveyed had experienced some form of unsolicited lewd images. That's a staggering amount. If you just put that in context, if you're walking down the street, that is basically almost every woman being flashed in real life. That is crazy. And yet we are so much more tolerant of this in the online space than we would be in the offline space. And so because of that work, we did two things. First, we developed a tool that is a safety feature within our products and services called Private Detector. It's an AI tool that automatically blurs the images of intimate body parts to ensure that the recipient doesn't feel anxiety on receiving this unsolicited nude, and gives them the opportunity to either view the image or decline to review the image and report the sender. And this is to ensure that the members, the recipients, are empowered in this space. But on the policy side, the space that I work in, it's also to proactively call for legislative intervention when it's needed. I think there is this misnomer around technology companies being anti-regulation. I think there are a number who may take that position, but in an organization like ours, we're very much interested in making sure the right laws are on the books. And in this instance, both in the US and in the UK, we have been publicly advocating for cyber flashing to be a criminal offense, because flashing somebody in real life would be a criminal offense. And so it is making sure that there is this two-pronged approach. There is proactiveness in the side of industry in developing the safety tools to ensure that their members feel safe not only on their platforms, but to the extent that they can more broadly, but also in the policy space in making sure that there is no shyness in saying, well, actually, we need to make sure there is legislation here so everybody understands what is and isn't acceptable. And a minimum standard is whatever is criminal offline should also be considered criminal online.
Thank you, Nima. That's really really thorough overview, I think, of the kind of multi-stakeholder approach that we probably need to be adopting to really actually make a difference with this problem. And I hope we can have a little bit of a chance to get back to some of those approaches in a little bit more detail towards the end. I guess I'd really like to try and get to the kind of what is at stake here question, right? What is the risk if we don't act, if we don't solve this problem, if it gets worse, if, as Gina mentioned, metaverse technologies perhaps provide embodied, virtual sexual harassment, or interact with deepfakes and image nudifying applications. It's an area I've done a fair bit of research on. What is at stake for society if we don't tackle this problem, Gina?
This spring, on International Women's Day, we launched a report through the Minderoo Center for Technology and Democracy with the OECD, UNESCO, and the Inter-America Development Bank on AI and women's work. And when we talk about coming AI and work, we often think about how new technologies are going to substitute for jobs or change the composition of skills that are required. That's one thing. But in case study after case study, we saw, both in the global north and the global south, organizations struggling to understand how women were dealing with online harassment. And so, for example, we see journalists in Brazil and high-profile Nobel Peace Prize winning journalists in the Philippines facing enormous online harassment and deepfakes, and speaking out about these tools, these targeted attacks via technology. We see how women politicians in many countries have chosen to bring their profiles offline or lock their profiles so that they are no longer subject to these attacks. And on the one hand, we're not taking as a society seriously the real harms that people face. So another example with a doctoral student and a team at Northampton University. We worked on a toolkit for online harms for women that we don't think of cybersecurity, for example. We're not thinking in our security terms. We're thinking about these attacks that happen from outside, or that they're attacks, they're more serious threats, rather than the threats that women, customers, users, people are facing in their everyday interactions. And so the stakes are enormously high, because what I think we're looking at is the capacity for a chilling effect for who gets to participate freely and fully in society, not just online life, but in society going forward. And so that's what I think we have to be, creatively, both through technological solutions, but perhaps more importantly, through policy interventions, doing things today to help make sure those dystopian futures don't happen tomorrow.
Yeah, thank you, Gina. I think the point of female politicians having to set their profiles offline, that silencing impact is incredibly insidious. And as you said, we're already seeing it now in our current landscape. And as technology becomes even more ubiquitous in society, can't imagine that's going to get any better if we don't adopt some of those policy recommendations and other approaches. Sophie, in your really incredible work, you've spoken to a lot of victims and heard some really personal stories around these harms.
Yeah.
I wonder if you might be able to tell us about some of those experiences and how they've impacted real people, individuals.
Yeah, so as you say, particularly, a lot of the work I've done is around cyber flashing. And that has, let's not kid ourselves, that has impacts right now. Tomorrow, in years, this will become worse. But right now, women are already adapting their lives to cope with, these harms. So on a really, if we look at this on a really small scale, individuals, women I've spoken to are, they don't feel safe leaving the house, or they change their train routes, or they change where they go out to shop, or they change how they behave, or they change how they use their phone. And I know that sounds, perhaps like a small thing, or just turn your AirDrop off. But this, that just speaks to a belief that we still have as a society, that if women just adapt their behaviour slightly, then that will sort it out enough, actually. And we don't really need to tackle the real problem here. Just turn your AirDrop off, or just get another train, or just whatever. And so we're already seeing, women I've spoken to, we're already doing those things of slightly adapting their behaviour because of the harms that will cause to them. But I was recently wrote a piece about the Internet of Things, as we've sort of discussed, and in that, speaking to Refuge and the National Stalking Helpline and bodies like this working in that space, they are already seeing, and particularly as a result of the pandemic, Refuge, 97% of the cases they deal with now have some aspect of complex tech abuse. 97% already. And the National Stalking Helpline, every single person who had contacted that helpline in the last 12 months, there was some aspect of digital stalking involved. This is going to get worse, but it's already terrible now. It's already, you can see the numbers. And I think particularly the pandemic, forced a lot of us online more. Lots of people are already online a lot anyway, but, all of a sudden your whole job perhaps had to be conducted online, or your schooling, and things like that. And so, the scope of this is already huge. The impact on people is already huge. And I think one of the things that I learned quite early on, speaking to experts and speaking to women who this is happening to, is the impact of this sort of harm in the digital space and in the physical space, let's call it. They aren't different. One isn't worse than the other. It's not worse because the person is stood right in front of you. In fact, lots of people said, actually, at least if you're in King's Cross Station, let's say, and a person comes up to you and flashes in a trench coat, we talk really old school, everyone else around you can see exactly what's happening. Other people can identify that person. They might be able to do something about it. If it's on your phone, no one else knows. It's on, it's on that device. And I think in many ways those harms are, can feel more invasive and more intrusive and more harmful and disturbing. So I think things are already pretty bad now in terms of the harms, and we can't get into this thought of, or one is worse than the other, and experts in the violence against women field will tell you as well, you can't predict how a harm will manifest in an individual. for one person, it might be, I just brushed it off, actually, it didn't really bother me. For another person, that might be something that, sends them into some kind of spiral. For whatever reason, you can't predict what those harms are going to be, and they're certainly not lesser because they're online rather than face-to-face.
Absolutely. I think we're now entering a time when the kind of physical virtual distinction of virtual not being real life is increasingly redundant. And it makes me think of the case, of course, tragically with Sarah Everard, where some of the reactions were, well, don't go out at night on your own. And it's like, well, just turn off your airdrop or modify your behavior. And it's fundamentally the wrong approach to try and expect women to kind of change their behaviors or remove themselves from spaces in that way. And I think it's a very, what's the word? It's very ominous, as you said, because it's happening now, and it won't get better if we don't do anything about it. I guess on that note, Nima, maybe we could talk about some of the things that we can do, and hopefully end at least the discussion part of this session on a slightly more optimistic note around, again, some of the great work you've been doing with Gina, particularly around AI-enabled image abuse, and this is the use of what are also known as deepfakes to swap women's faces into pornographic footage or to synthetically strip images of women. And so I would love to hear some of the things that you are working on with Gina around this problem.
Isn't it refreshing when the corporate in the room is like cheering everybody up, saying, let's give you a pep talk. By all means, I think AI nudification is another layer of this ongoing trend that technology innovation is moving in a space where if you're creating tools that have no other use cases but to perpetuate harm against one gender, what are we doing as a society? If this is the type of innovation that we are not trying to put guardrails behind publicly, then how does that even, what does that mean for the future of the metaverse? What does that mean for us in 10 years' time, in 30 years' time, when we are seeing these tools being disseminated online across several jurisdictions, and it is not even on the radar of some policymakers, let alone at a place where they can even sensibly talk about how to regulate it or how to curb that type of innovation. And so we are at this crossroads. There is a real global inflection point right now when it comes to emerging technologies, where everybody's now woken up to the reality that being online has really significant harms, potential, but also has made our lives a lot easier and a lot more impactful. And so how do you ensure you continue to cultivate innovation without without necessarily stifling it through over-regulation? And I think in this space, one of the things is ensuring that there is this public-private cooperation. The reality that industry can go so far, but when it comes to issues like prioritization, given that every platform has a different type of personality because of the composition of its founder, its board, the type of services that they're providing, you need to be able to have a way of level setting what the do's and don'ts are. And currently the do's and don'ts are determined by them individually. And now we're getting to a place where in some regions, there is that regulation. There is the policymakers are engaging. They are becoming a lot more expert in this. And it's important to be able to proactively engage with them on these issues. The challenge is inevitably a societal one, because in the reality that we're facing today and how it is unfolding online, women are reducing their interactions online. They are becoming less visible, and that is not going to generate a healthy online environment, and that is not going to cultivate innovation in the way that we would want it to. So I do think there is an element of regulation, but there's also an element of education. Educating the younger generation, but also everybody else, to ensure they understand how they should be interacting online, how to stay safe online. I think that there isn't enough conversation about media literacy and the understanding that there is certain things to look out for. There are certain questions you have to ask yourself when you're signing terms of service. There are certain ethoses that you should be looking out for when you're signing up for an app. And these are all things that we have just become used to taking it for granted. You know, you want to download something, you don't read the terms and conditions, you move on quickly. But actually, the more aware you become, the more empowered you will inevitably be in understanding what type of data is being taken from you, what type of information is being collected when you use this, but also how this will then be used by third parties who may have access to that information. And particularly in the innovation space, also encouraging our developers to think before they innovate these tools in a way that then will only have a use case that is only negative, that is only perpetuating harm. We wouldn't allow that if it was a car manufacturer, right? A car manufacturer that says, okay, we're going to build cars that blow up as soon as you turn the engine on. No one would allow that. So why would you do this for AI, which is perhaps the most important innovation that we currently have unfolding? So I think these are things that are really, really important for us to make sure we can have this frank conversation right now about it and be really transparent around what our end goal, what does success look like for us as a society here?
Absolutely. Gina, I don't know if you'd like to pick up on that.
We have, at the center, we've co-hosted a series of workshops on AI-enabled intimate image abuse. Now, let's be really clear. This is one small tip of a very large iceberg of harms that women face online. But it gives us an opportunity to future-proof today's legislation and regulations. So when here in the UK, when we think about the online safety bill that's currently being debated and discussed, we can use that to look at this particular case and say, how might this apply and where might the gaps be? And right now, with this idea that we can have AI-generated nude parts of an image that attach to a quote-unquote real image of a woman's face, you know, those synthetic images kind of fall in the gaps of our legislation. Like, we're not ready for that in terms of legislation. And yet, in communities, right, this kind of notion that someone's image circulates without their consent in ways that to them feels exposed, whether it's a woman without her clothes or a woman without the appropriate dress that's appropriate for her community. You know, when that happens, that's being seen by some as not a very serious problem. And yet it's a huge affront to people in their communities. It's a community-based harm. And so we have to think, I think we have to think really creatively in two-pronged approach. First, we have to make sure that these challenges with misogyny and these challenges with gender-based harms are actually adequately covered in the legislation that we write today. And we have to be advocating and working towards that. And that's part of the work that we've been doing at the Minderoo Center and with Bumble and Henry and others. And please join us in that work. I think the second is we have to remember that we can't simply take an individual consumer approach. Sorry, corporate. It gets us part of the way, the terms and services model to thinking about where we go forward. But we really do have to be pushing as citizens, as society, as you know, our legislators have to help us push for building online environments that support healthy communities, because we're looking at what are, in effect, social harms. If we have a chilling effect of basically driving women off the internet, that's going to hurt all of us. And that's what's at stake. That's what we've got to do. So, you know, working through the current legislative process is one, thinking about how we can make sure to future-proof that legislation for these emerging technologies, and finally, really recentering this for the kind of equity that we want to see in society. We've got to make sure that the kind of equitable futures, they are futures that we'll be building online. So let's get to work on them today.
Absolutely, very well put. Sophie, we've got just a minute left before we need to move to Q&A, but I guess as somebody who's written a book on what men can do to help with this problem? I'm sure there are men in the audience who are thinking, well, what can I do? I wondered if you wanted to kind of close this discussion by talking about what individuals can do, and particularly men who maybe feel guilty or part of the problem, or wanting to help with that problem. What can they do?
Yeah, so I think, whenever I talk about this, obviously, we're all humans, a little bit lazy. Everyone wants, I want a tick list of, if I do these 5 things, women will feel safer. Or when I walk home at night, I won't scare women or whatever. And I get that. But actually, as Gina sort of alluded to, this is big change. This is radical change. This is, what we actually need is to really change things from the ground up. There needs to be, in order to have the next generation, because a lot of this, as we've said, is just old behaviors on new platforms. So while the tech companies do need to change, some of what they're doing, also, if we're going to actually make this radical change, we have to start, at the bottom right. So what men can do in particular, the first thing is to acknowledge this is a gendered harm. This is a gendered harm, and I think we've seen this in the online safety bill and in discussions generally. People, for whatever reasons, always sort of want to say, oh, well, everyone's subject to harm, and everyone's, especially online, and, violence against women, which is what the book is about and how men can help, it is a gendered issue. You look at all of the stats, you look at all of the lived experience, it's a gendered issue. So the first thing is, if you want to help, accept that, and also accept that it does happen, even if you don't see it in your communities and your friendship groups, it's happening. The second thing is to acknowledge, to not buy into this argument of not all men, they cry. Actually, even if you're not behaving badly, let's say, that's not enough. In the same way that we've had discussions around racism and being, actively anti-racist, men need to be actively anti-misogyny, violence against women, acting, and speaking out about these things. And calling it out when you see it is, maybe it's easy for me to say, and I know that's a hard thing for people to do, but to start to voice that intolerance, to plant those small seeds of dissent, that's how we do this, and to listen to the women around you, to come to panels like this, and to see those harms that, even though perhaps through, I think Henry said at one point, as a man, perhaps I wouldn't have thought about the harm that could cause. Acknowledging that your lived experience shapes your perception of something. And just because you might not find something threatening, or you might not have perceived it in that way, that doesn't mean that women and non-binary people and other people with their lived experience, that is not threatening to them. And so, there's just a few things, but I think accepting the problem is there and that it is gendered, accepting the scale of it, accepting that everyone has a role to play in this, and starting to call it out if you feel that you can.
Thank you. That's a powerful list of calls to action there.
Enjoy.
Yeah, there's lots to think about. So that concludes the discussion part of our session. And I think now we're going to move to a Q&A. So if you do have a question, please let lady at the front know, and she can come over with the microphone.
Hello, my name is Marcus. Thank you for your insights. I heard a lot about, Nima said that we won't allow to build cars that blow up, but actually we are building weapons in countries, right? And also I heard the word regulation a lot. I think that will come, but maybe too late. So my question is, do you see trends or technologies, or which technology would you wish for today, so that we can really fight the source, as Sophie said, so that all this harm preemptively can be addressed?
I'm happy to comment on that, if it's okay. I think especially around things like synthetic media and AI-generated synthetic media, or deepfakes as they're more commonly known, these are kind of inherently dual-use technologies in a lot of senses, right? Face swapping can be used and is being used in Hollywood. It's being used in novelty face swapping apps, which are fairly benign, but obviously it's also being used extensively in non-consensual image abuse context online. And I guess the tool that Nima spoke about, nudifying tools, the origins of the algorithms for those tools was actually what's called like an image translation algorithm. So it was designed to kind of make like a sunny looking photo, a stormy looking photo, and was then weaponized in this way by someone who clearly had malicious intent. And I think for me, the question is about the person developing that algorithm at the beginning, even if they have benign intent or they have no malintent, need to think much more carefully about safety and design at those origin stages of that technology's development, think about the lifespan of it, how it could be misused, what can they put in place to stop it being used in that way. But Nima, I think maybe that's something you'd like to add to.
No, I think you make an excellent point, and it's also I think currently there's a lot of discussion in the UK around online safety in the context of content moderation and the online safety bill. However, I think there is perhaps an earlier stage that Henry was alluding to when at inception there should be some guidance, some guardrails around how AI is being innovated. And if you focus only on the content moderation, that's the output. Most of the harm at that point, when we talk about AI nudification, has already happened, right? The image is out there, and it's very difficult once an altered image is out there to try and bring it back in and take it offline. The questions should be asked at the outset when the AI is being innovated from just altering lighting, saturation in an image to creating a deep fake that is incredibly realistic of a woman who is fully clothed in a nudified state. That is the type of innovation that should, at the outset, have those guardrails around it. And I think, this is the types of example of emerging technologies that we're seeing that either were more often than not created for other purposes, AirTags, as you were mentioning, and being misused. But as soon as those use cases come out where they are being misused, it is important to make sure that there is that intervention. And it's sad to say, but more often than not, it is the policy intervention that is the most powerful in terms of ensuring that this type of activity is no longer encouraged, which is why, to curb the issue of cyber flashing, it wasn't enough for us to create a safety tool proactively for our platforms. We have actively been engaging policymakers and passing bills in the US and calling for legislative change in the UK, because we understand that what is a priority for us as a business may not be a priority for other platforms. And we need to make sure that we are prioritizing issues that are facing women's digital safety. And that is not always something that is prioritized by industry of their own accord.
And we're playing catch up, right? So safety tools are necessary, but not sufficient. They simply won't develop as fast as the innovation around synthetic media and deepfake technology, generally speaking. So we can't simply rely on technological fixes to this problem. They'll get us part of the way there, and we certainly shouldn't give up, but we can't place all of our bets on the tech.
Absolutely. I think that's a response to many harms that deepfakes cause, is people think a detection system will solve the problem, when actually people know most of the time these are fake, but it doesn't stop the harms to the women being targeted. But I think that multi-pronged approach is critical. Thank you. Anyone else have any questions? I think this lady just here. Not too well. Is it on? You go for a shout. Oh, there we go.
Yeah, there we go.
Thank you.
Thank you. When you talk about content moderation, I do believe content moderation is very important for each platform to be placed on in terms of tackling the online harm. However, do you think it's important to get human in the loop as well? Because think about content moderation, when we use AI, machine learning, it's not efficient. And also human in the loop is something that we could help build out and help to make the AI more perfect as well. But how do you balance the privacy in terms of the user? Because obviously they're sending in and out test content or of their facial recognition, whatever, the profile on, let's say, Bumble as a platform. But adding human in the loop obviously is not really a good choice to protect the privacy. So how do you balance that?
That's an excellent question. And the reality is, for our platform, there are human reviewers. When we talk about moderating content on our products and services, it is a combination of automation and human reviewers, precisely because however advanced AI tools are, there are nuances and contexts that are important for a human to understand, to really be able to determine when somebody submits a report complaining about an experience they've had, either with another user or just in terms of how they are experiencing the platform, that they're able to have an interaction with a human reviewer who can make those assessments, particularly in cases where there is either a number of harms or are particularly sensitive issues. So I think, I can't speak to other platforms. I do think in industry, it is more often the case that it is a combination of automation and human reviewers. But to your point around balancing privacy and safety, I think that is the trillion-dollar question. It is certainly something that is important to have guidance on how to do that balancing, and the conversation around the online safety bill, which we have been reacting to and several other platforms have been reacting to, has been precisely asking for that clarity. Even the most basic things in terms of how you define online harms, and what legal but harmful looks like, and all of these things are really important to have that steering from regulators to be able to then tell the platforms, okay, you need to make these edits to the way your system's already built, or in our case, if our policies are already broader than the minimum standard, that then doesn't get curbed by the legislation, that we can continue to be expansive in how we define online harms and online harassment to include things like body shaming. So I hope that answers your question.
And we can push for one step further than human in the loop, right?
Yeah.
We can, one of the things that the UK is working on in the online safety bill is to push platforms to do risk assessments of what could go wrong on their platforms. And I think if there's one lesson that we know from the research that my brilliant doctoral students have done, including Julia Schlepska on feminist cybersecurity, it's that sort of threat modeling for those everyday harms, the threat modelings for the domestic harms, the threat modeling for the intimate partner violence, the threat modeling for thinking about how ordinary people and ordinary citizens could be harmed by security threats, but how they might also weaponize platforms. And so asking platforms to really rigorously do those risk analysis as part of the online safety bill is going to help us have the experts in the products and services that we all in the room want to use and be a part of. We're going to have the people who build them have a really deep think about what could go wrong and how to fix it. But in a way that is transparent to people outside of the company. So I think that's something that, we need to remember that's in our toolkits, right? We're not going to have a tech fix for every solution, but we do have some things in our toolkits that we can bring out and bring to this problem.
Sure. Sophie, I don't know if there was anything you wanted to add.
No, nothing more to add.
Excellent. Cool. We have 1 minute left, so I guess I'd just add one caveat to that point, which is around the human impact of content moderation, right? And there's been some excellent reporting done, particularly by Casey Newton, around the impact psychologically on human in the loop style moderation and seeing this kind of content. And I think it's a really difficult challenge to get right, scaling it right, different cultures, different backgrounds as to how you would understand what is deemed appropriate or not. But certainly it's something that right now a lot of platforms are not doing well enough at. And I think if they truly faced the scale of the problem that they had to face with content moderation, they'd probably become a lot less profitable. So I think that's one of the challenges. And at the moment, a lot of human moderators are suffering through those practices as well. So I think human moderation, human in the loop, crucial, but those humans have to be treated like humans, not like robots, right? So I think that is it. We are officially out of time. That was good timing. Thank you so much.